First off, God bless you and your week. We are so glad you're joining us today.
Yes, absolutely. It is great to be here.
So imagine, right, you log into your bank account, you see this 20% penalty fee, and you realize, wait, this isn't from my credit card company. This is like literally a penalty from God.
Right, a literal divine fee.
Exactly. So today we are taking a deep dive into an ancient document that is basically the ultimate terms and conditions agreement for religious promises.
Which is such a great way to put it.
Thank you. We're looking at Leviticus chapter 27, and we're pulling a lot of our insights today from the Holman and the NAA study Bibles. And our mission here is really to decode this ancient economics of faith. Like, what happens when this intense, abstract, spiritual zeal just slams into a brick wall of economic reality?
Yeah, because that's exactly what this chapter is dealing with.
Right. Because, I mean, we've all been there. You know, you make these huge promises when you're feeling overwhelmingly grateful or, like, super zealous. But what actually happened in the ancient Israelite world when Monday morning rolled around, the emotional high faded, and the bill for that massive promise came due.
Well, it's this really fascinating collision of theology and administration, I mean, right there on the page.
Yeah.
Because when people think of Leviticus, they usually think of, grand moral laws or the really messy sacrificial system.
For sure. Lots of blood and altars.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But chapter 27 is essentially an appendix. It's almost entirely dedicated to the economics of voluntary vows, because if the temple is going to function day to day, all that intense personal devotion has to be quantified somehow.
Because they have to pay the bills.
Right. You're dealing with a literal physical system that has to keep the lamps burning, feed the priesthood, and physically maintain a sanctuary. It takes resources.
Okay, so let's start with probably the most personal type of vow you could possibly make, which is dedicating a human being to God.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting.
So let's say you're an ordinary Israelite, and out of just sheer gratitude, maybe you survived a famine or a really bad illness, you promise yourself to the service of the sanctuary, or maybe you promise your child. But the immediate problem you run into is the actual law.
Yes, the legal boundary.
Right, because if you're not from the tribe of Levi, you are legally barred from performing physical labor in the sanctuary. You can't just, show up with a broom and start sweeping the tabernacle floor.
Yeah, you definitely cannot. So you have this intense desire to serve, but a hard, non-negotiable legal boundary preventing that physical service.
Yep.
But the ancient system provided this really brilliant release valve, basically.
It was redemption, right?
Exactly, redemption. Since you couldn't legally give your actual physical labor, you paid the financial equivalent of that labor into the sanctuary treasury instead.
And this wasn't just like throw whatever you have in the offering plate. It wasn't an arbitrary donation. The NAA Study Bible points out that there was this hyper-specific fixed valuation scale, and it was based entirely on age and gender.
Very specific.
Yeah. So if you were a male between 20 and 60 years old, your vow was valued at 50 shekels of silver, which the notes actually clarify is about 600 grams of silver.
Which is a lot.
It's a huge amount.
Yeah.
And then a female in that exact same age bracket was valued at 30 shekels, or about 360 grams. And then, the prices dropped pretty significantly for youths, young children, and the elderly.
And, the Holman notes actually bring up a really famous biblical example here, which helps ground this. Hannah.
With Samuel.
Yeah, she vowed to give her son Samuel to the Lord, and she actually followed through and left him at the sanctuary to serve under Eli, because he was going to serve. But under this Levitical law, had she wanted to keep him home while still, honoring her vow to God, this system would have legally allowed her to just pay a redemption price.
Wow, so she had options.
She did, which highlights the practical utility of this law. It gave ordinary people a highly structured way to express just extraordinary devotion without completely breaking the legal boundaries of the priesthood.
Okay, let's unpack this, though, because hearing this today, looking at it through a modern lens, it's incredibly jarring.
I know, it really is.
I mean, isn't assigning a rigid spreadsheet-style monetary value to age and gender inherently problematic? Even if we say it's just about labor, doesn't putting a lower price tag on the elderly or on young children kind of, codify a diminished status in the eyes of the community? I mean, it literally feels like they are putting a price tag on a human soul.
It absolutely reads that way to our modern sensibilities. I totally get that.
Yeah.
But we really have to separate our modern concept of the intrinsic value of a human soul from the raw economic output of an ancient agrarian society.
Okay, fair.
This scale wasn't measuring a person's spiritual worth to the divine. God wasn't saying, you're only worth 30 shekels to me. The sanctuary was calculating the literal replacement cost of the physical labor being pledged,
Oh, I see.
right? Because in a harsh farming culture, a man between 20 and 60 simply generated more raw agricultural capital than a child or an elderly person. It's just a harsh economic reality of the ancient world.
Okay, I understand the labor replacement argument. I do. But it still feels like a really cold, bureaucratic way to handle someone's spiritual devotion. I mean, what if someone simply didn't have 50 shekels? 600 grams of silver is a massive amount of wealth for a guy who's just a subsistence farmer. Do they, like, go into debt to God?
No, and that is where the text introduces what I consider one of the most profound pieces of legislation in the entire ancient world. It's the poverty clause in verse 8.
Oh, I love this part.
It's amazing. If someone made a vow in a moment of passion, but they were too poor to afford the fixed rate, that rigid spreadsheet was completely thrown out.
But just ignored the set price.
Completely. They were brought before the priest, and the priest evaluated them based entirely on what they could actually afford to pay.
So the system bends to accommodate human reality.
Precisely. The fixed scale was the standard to prevent the wealthy from, cheapening their devotion. They couldn't just pay a pittance. But human reality dictated the final cost for the vulnerable.
Wow.
Yeah, it forces the person to take their commitment seriously. You can't just walk away from the vow entirely.
Yeah.
But it is infused with this divine compassion so that honoring a promise doesn't literally bankrupt a family. It's this remarkable balance between demanding integrity and protecting the poor.
That is really beautiful. But okay, so if human labor was commodified like this to protect the sanctuary and fund its operations, what happens when a farmer leverages his actual means of production?
Right, his property.
Yeah, his land, his houses, his livestock. Because unlike a person, a house doesn't have a defined lifespan of labor. It's just a thing. Which brings us to what I like to call the ancient buyer's remorse tax.
The divine restocking fee. It really is a masterful psychological deterrent against impulsive behavior.
It is so funny to me. So just imagine you get swept up in the emotion of like a religious festival and you dedicate an unclean animal to the sanctuary, like a donkey, for example.
Right, because it's unclean, it can't be sacrificed on the altar.
Exactly. So it just becomes the property of the priest. The priest comes out, he evaluates your donkey, and he sets a price. But a week later, Monday morning rolls around and you realize, oh no, I desperately need that donkey to plow my field.
You need it back.
You really need it back. And the law says you are allowed to buy it back, but you have to pay the priest's valuation plus a 20% surcharge, like 1/5 extra.
And what's fascinating here is we have to ask why that surcharge exists. Think about the logistics from the temple's perspective. The sanctuary is not a real estate agency, and it is definitely not a livestock bazaar. If you have thousands of Israelites randomly donating donkeys and houses and then changing their minds a week later, the administrative burden on the priests would be absolutely paralyzing.
They'd just be managing a massive lost and found of livestock, just donkeys everywhere.
Exactly. So the 20% tax serves a dual purpose. First, it strongly incentivizes people to just pay the silver valuation in the first place. That keeps the temple funded with liquid assets, silver, rather than useless property they have to feed and house.
That makes total sense.
And second, it enforces personal integrity. God is not haggling with you. If you make a promise, you keep it. If you back out, it literally costs you. It forces a person to pause and really count the cost before they even open their mouth.
Yeah, and the rules actually get even stricter when we talk about clean animals, like sheep or goats, the ones that actually were meant for the altar.
Oh yeah, no messing around with those.
The text explicitly states there is absolutely no swapping or substituting allowed. You can't dedicate a flawless, prize-winning sheep, take it home, and then secretly think to yourself, you know what, the priest won't notice if I just swap this out for that scrawny sheep with the limp.
The consequences for trying to pull a fast one right there are severe.
The rule says if you try to secretly trade a bad sheep for the good one you originally promised, both animals permanently become holy to the sanctuary.
You lose both.
Yeah. You try to sneak a bad sheep in, and the priest essentially says, thanks, we'll take both now. You lose the prize winner and the runt.
Which, again, completely removes that human tendency to look for loopholes. You cannot hold the sanctuary's vital funding hostage to human fickleness or, just outright greed.
Right. Okay, so valuing a donkey or a sheep, that's fairly straightforward. But valuing real estate is where this text turns into an incredibly complex economic puzzle.
It really does.
Because ancient Israelite land laws were super unique. Land wasn't permanently owned the way we think of, like a modern mortgage. And to really understand how they valued land dedications, we have to look at the ultimate economic reset button, the year of Jubilee.
Yes, the Jubilee happened every 50 years, and it is absolutely the linchpin for understanding the entire Israelite economy. According to their theology, the Israelites didn't actually own the land themselves. God owned the land.
Right.
The families essentially just held long-term leases from God.
So the sources outline that if you dedicated a field you inherited from your ancestors, the priest didn't value it based on its acreage or its square footage. They actually valued it based on its yield, specifically the amount of seed needed to plant it.
Like the barley seed.
Exactly. The standard was 1 homer of barley seed equaled 50 shekels of silver. But, and here's the catch, the value of that land actively depreciated the closer the calendar got to the year of Jubilee.
Because in the year of Jubilee, all inherited land automatically reverted back to its original family line, no matter what.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because it sounds exactly like a depreciating lease agreement. If the Jubilee is, say, 40 years away, the land is worth a lot of silver. But if the Jubilee is only 2 years away, it's worth a tiny fraction of that, because the sanctuary only gets 2 years of barley harvest before they legally have to give the land back.
Yeah, that's their socioeconomic safety net in action. The Jubilee prevented families from slipping into permanent generational poverty. And, on the flip side, it prevented wealthy elites from establishing massive land monopolies.
Because everything resets.
Exactly. Even if your grandfather made terrible financial decisions and lost the whole family farm, in the year of Jubilee, the slate was wiped clean. Your family got their livelihood back.
But the sanctuary laws introduced this massive, incredibly strict loophole to the safety net.
They do.
Let's say a person dedicates their ancestral field to the sanctuary. They never bother to actually pay the silver to redeem it, and the sanctuary eventually sells the rights to that land to someone else. When the Jubilee year finally arrives, that specific land is not returned to the original family.
No, it does.
It becomes permanently holy. It belongs to the priests forever. Yet, and this is the crazy part, if it was purchased land, meaning land you bought from a neighbor and then dedicated, at Jubilee, it always returned to the original family who sold it, not the sanctuary. So why is there such a sharp, almost punitive distinction for inherited land?
So to understand that, we have to look at the theology behind the inheritance itself. Inherited land was seen as a direct divine grant. It was your family's specific portion given directly by God.
Okay.
If you bought land from a neighbor, you were basically just buying the rights to its produce until the next Jubilee. You couldn't vow it away permanently because it wasn't truly yours to give. It belonged to your neighbor's family. But your inherited land, that was your sacred responsibility.
So if you vow your inherited land and then completely neglect to redeem it.
You were showing profound disregard for your divine inheritance.
Yeah.
If you let the sanctuary sell it to the third party just because you can't be bothered to pay the redemption price, the law essentially says, okay, you have forfeited your divine grant.
Wow.
It's severely penalized incredible negligence. You couldn't use religious dedications as a sneaky legal trick to temporarily offload land you didn't want to manage, only to expect it back for free at the Jubilee.
It demands total accountability.
Yeah.
Which perfectly sets up the final section of Leviticus 27. Because we've walked through everything you can choose to dedicate, but the chapter ends with this dramatic plot twist. It lists the whole category of things you cannot dedicate simply because they aren't yours to give in the first place.
Right, the unvowables.
The unvowables, I love that. You cannot vow a firstborn animal to God as a special voluntary gift because the law clearly states the firstborn already automatically belongs to God. You can't give a gift of something you literally don't own. And the same goes for tithes, the flat 10% of your land's produce and your herds. The Holman commentary points out that tithing wasn't like a new concept invented here in Leviticus. It existed long before this law, dating all the way back to Abraham giving a tenth to Melchizedek.
Yes.
And it remained the absolute baseline for the daily functioning of the temple for centuries.
Because a vow is supposed to be above and beyond.
Yeah.
You can't claim you are making this generous, voluntary sacrifice to God when you are simply paying the baseline tax required of every citizen. It doesn't count as a special gift.
That makes sense. And the mechanism they use to determine the tithe for the herds, it's so visually striking, the sources call it passing under the shepherd's rod.
Oh, this is fascinating.
They would let the animals walk out of a pen, one by one, and every 10th animal that passed under the rod was marked as holy to the Lord. And again, no swapping allowed. But I have to ask, doesn't this turn tithing into a bizarre lottery?
What do you mean?
Well, what if the 10th sheep happens to be your absolute best prize-winning ram? Or what if it's the scrawniest, sickliest runt of the litter? Like, it's just pure chance.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture,
Mm-hmm.
the randomness is the entire point. It completely removes human calculation from the equation.
Oh, I see.
Because if you were allowed to choose, human pride might dictate that you pick the best animal just to show off your wealth to your neighbors. Look how generous I am. Or human greed might dictate that you pick the worst animal to be cheap with God.
Right.
The rod is blind. It is pure objective obedience. Whatever comes 10th is the Lord's. You are entirely surrendering your right to curate the gift.
Surrendering the right to curate. That is a powerful concept. And honestly, it leads us to the most intense form of surrender in this entire text. It's a concept called kerem, or the anathema.
Yes, very intense.
Yeah. The text describes this as things permanently and entirely devoted to the Lord. These things cannot be sold. They cannot be redeemed under any circumstances. And chillingly, any person under this ban was put to death. The study notes link this to the Canaanites in times of war, or extreme blasphemers. It's an incredibly heavy, dark concept.
It is heavy, and it is vital that we distinguish kerem from the everyday voluntary vows we've been analyzing so far. A voluntary vow is an expression of devotion from a worshiper.
Yeah.
Kerem, the anathema, is a category of absolute divine justice and total irrevocable surrender.
It's completely different.
Exactly. When something was designated as kerem, it was considered so wholly given over to God's judgment or ownership that human beings were completely removed from interacting with it or profiting from it ever again.
It's the ultimate line in the sand. You cannot monetize the anathema. In fact, the Holman note draws a direct parallel between this ancient strictness and a really famous story in the early Christian church, Ananias and Sapphira from the book of Acts.
The connection there is so profound because Ananias and Sapphira sold a piece of property and publicly claimed they were giving the entire amount to the apostles. They were essentially treating the money as a totally devoted thing, wholly given to God.
But they didn't actually do that.
No, secretly, they kept a portion back for themselves. They tried to swap the animals, so to speak. They tried to play games with what was supposed to be wholly devoted, and it cost them their lives. The theological principle spans all the way from Leviticus to the New Testament. You do not trivialize what belongs to the divine. You do not treat the holy as if it were mundane.
Wow. So we've traveled through this ancient world of silver shekels, depreciating ancestral farmland, 20% surcharges, and sheep passing blindly under a shepherd's rod.
We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. And it is a massive departure from the way we view religion today. But Leviticus 27 proves that in ancient Israel, spirituality was never just about abstract thoughts and prayers. It was grounded in concrete, calculated economic sacrifice.
It demanded deep integrity. It required a literal, physical manifestation of an invisible faith. And I think it beautifully balanced God's absolute holiness with the very real, messy realities of human poverty and changing circumstances.
Yeah.
But critically, it never let the worshiper completely off the hook from their commitments.
And even if you aren't paying 50 shekels of silver today, this ancient text actively challenges how we measure our own commitments. Do we look for loopholes when our promises start to actually cost us something?
Right.
When the initial zeal fades, do we try to secretly swap out the good sheep for the scrawny one in how we spend our time or our energy or our finances?
It forces you to ask whether your convictions actually have measurable weight. If there is no cost to you, is there really a commitment?
That's a great point. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We live in a modern world defined by frictionless digital subscription.
Oh, absolutely.
You can sign up for something on an emotional whim and cancel it 3 weeks later with a single click, completely consequence-free. We are culturally conditioned to avoid long-term cost and to just expect easy exits.
We really are.
But what would it do to our modern sense of commitment in our relationships, our communities, our personal goals, if changing our minds about a promise came with a literal, undeniable 20% surcharge? Would we be as quick to click agree on those terms and conditions?
That is a phenomenal question. It completely changes the way you evaluate your own worth.
It certainly changes the way you look at a Monday morning bill. Thank you so much for joining us on this intellectual journey into the economics of faith. We love taking these deep dives with you, parsing out the history, the mechanics, and the underlying logic of these incredible ancient texts. God bless you all, take care, and we will catch you on the next one.